Laboratory X-8, also known as the Central Laboratory. It is one of the most important secret locations in the entire zone. Who knows what kind of experiments were conducted down there? Hello stalkers, and welcome to the Anomalous Dugout. In this video we will explore Lab X-8 under Pripyat and try to uncover its secrets. Before we start, be aware that there will be major spoilers. Also, this video is part of a series, so I suggest you go watch the previous episodes if you haven't already. Link to the playlist in the description. In the plot of Call of Pripyat, the protagonist Major Dektyrev will first learn about Lab X-8 while exploring other locations. The place is mentioned in documents from the Jupiter factory, and then in the testing workshop. In these papers, X-8 is designated as the Central Laboratory, hinting at the fact that it used to be the HQ of the group, the clandestine organization of scientists working in the zone. As we saw in previous videos, the development and the production of the Gauss rifle was connected to the network of underground laboratories, including the testing workshop, the Jupiter factory, the Pripyat 1 underpass, and of course, Lab X-8. During his investigations, Major Dektyrev also discovered that Lebedev, a person you might recognize as the leader of the Clear Sky faction, was in fact part of the science team working in X-Labs prior to the second Chernobyl disaster. The Major also discovered a magnetic card that would allow him to penetrate in the central lab, located in the basement of the Yubileiny center in Pripyat. But before accessing the lab, there are still a few details we need to talk about. First of all, it is important to mention that the main goal of the mercenary faction in the story of Call of Pripyat is to raid Lab X-8. Because of this, Major Dektyrev will have to deal with them at some point, and depending on the results of the mission, the Merc's activity in Pripyat will change. In any case, Dektyrev successfully prevented the mercenaries and their clients from discovering the secrets of the lab, instead claiming them for himself and his superiors. Then there is the Monolith faction. Indeed, the Yubileiny Center, the building above the laboratory, is occupied by zombies as well as several squads of Monolith fighters. This is probably not a coincidence, as one of the missions of the Monolith faction is to protect the hidden secrets of the zone. In order to go down into the lab, one needs to restore the power to the elevator by restarting a generator on the top floor. One of the mercenaries working for Serbin repaired the generator before dying in unknown circumstances. As for Serbin himself, sniping him down during the mercenary meeting will reveal that he was in possession of a special magnetic card that we will be using in X-8 later on. When I was working on this video, a question came to my mind. What is the Yubileiny Service Center exactly? Does it exist in real life? Well, the answer is yes and no. No, because if you check the real map of Pripyat, you will find a kindergarten instead of the center. So while the city in the game was mostly recreated with a lot of fidelity to the real location, this specific spot was changed. However, the Stalker wiki mentions that the Yubileiny Center was designed after another existing building somewhere else in Pripyat, giving this photo as a proof. And now it's time to get inside Laboratory X-8. The main door is locked, but can be opened using the magnetic card acquired by our character earlier in the testing workshop. The other card, found on Serbin's body, can be used to unlock a storage room right near the entrance. Inside, we find many supplies, including 2 modern Russian assault rifles, the AN-95 and the Groza. This is quite an interesting detail, because in the real world, such weapons are normally used in limited quantities and only by the Russians. Of course, we know the appearance of the zone must have changed this situation, because in the games these weapons are used by the Ukrainian military as well as some stalkers. But here the context is different. X-8 was operating before the birth of the zone and has obviously been sealed for a long time. Therefore, the presence of such weapons here might be an indicator that the Russian military was involved in the secret experiments. I'm not really surprised to discover this, since the projects started before the end of the Soviet Union, but it's still interesting to find actual evidence. In terms of inhabitants, the lab contains a few packs of rodents, including some that ambush the player. Then we have some snorks, also using surprise attacks. A poltergeist is hiding in a small room up a ladder. He should be dealt with as fast as possible. And of course, the most dangerous enemies down here are the Bureaus. You will find a tricky one in the cafeteria. And then 3 more in a large so-called secret room that can only be accessed via the elevator shaft. Finally, if you pick up all the documents from the lab, a controller will appear to block the exit. He has to be defeated to unlock the door. Now, speaking of documents, this is what we are here for. Because X-8 was the headquarters of the group for a time, the precious files will contain information from many other X laboratories, as we will see right now. Let's start with the small room. The notebook contains a detailed description of an experiment assessing a psi-field's effect on an object in another hemisphere. A group of scientists in the Caribbean received the signal, but it was distorted. The signal was altered in a strange way, as though corrected by someone. A possible explanation is that the noosphere theory is correct, and the changes were made by the noosphere. So it appears that this experiment was one of the first proofs of the existence of the noosphere. Here we learn that the scientists first discovered psi-fields, and only then, while studying the said psi-fields, did they realize the presence of the informational field called the noosphere. Since there is no mention of a location, we can assume this experiment was conducted right here, in Lab X-8. Moving on to the cafeteria. The documents refer to one of the side discoveries of the research, specifically the discovery that living creatures are able to generate directed psi emissions. A biological field emitter, essentially a giant brain, was grown as part of the research conducted in Lab X-16. According to this document, the scientists figured out that living creatures can generate psi fields, and studies related to this discovery were conducted in Lab X-16. In my opinion, the psi emissions created by animals and mutants are so weak that they have no effects and are barely detectable. But the scientists tried to increase the natural capacity to generate these psi emissions, resulting in the creation of the brain in X-16, as well as the controllers. Let's check the Bureau's room. The report details the study of biological samples sent from Lab X-18. The samples were subjected to informational field effects of varying intensities. The report meticulously describes the mutation of living beings following exposure to emissions. Of course, the scientists studied the effects of the emissions on living creatures, a research that was carried out in Lab X-18. Here we talk about emissions coming from the informational field, which is probably slightly different from psi emissions. I believe that psi emissions are just one subcategory of informational field emissions. Anyway, it was the exposure of living beings to these emissions that created the first mutants. Next up is the lab room. Here we can admire a beautiful model of the rainbow emitter antennas, also known as the brain scorcher. The documents describe the technical characteristics of the antenna and how they deviate from their planned values. There is a note on the reverse side which indicates that these documents were prepared in Lab X-10. For starters, it is very likely that Lab X-10 and Lab X-19 are the same. Regardless, my theory is that the scientists developed biological and technological psi emitters at the same time. Biological emitters, such as large brains and living creatures, were studied in Lab X-16, while emitters based on technology were studied in X-19 or X-10, the construction of the brain scorcher being the outcome. Back to the Bureau's room. The manual describes how to use Item 62. The instructions emphasize that no adjustments need to be made for bullet trajectory or wind, as these are not important at distances within the weapon's effective range. Here we get the confirmation that X-8 was involved in the Ghost Rifle project, but it is unknown to what extent. There is nothing inside the lab indicating that it could have been a new production complex for the weapon following the closure of the Jupiter factory. Finally, the tanks room. The documents refer to the transfer of the research team and all materials to another laboratory called X-7, which will be used to research matters relating to the influence of the noosphere. The research team comprises N.A. Lebedev, E.F. Kalancha, and V.I. Suslov. This document explains that the headquarters of the group, which were previously based here in X-8, were moved to another unknown lab called X-7. It is possible that X-7 is the final lab seen in Shadow of Chernobyl, where Strelok finds the sea consciousness. But who knows? Also, the three names that are given here are not random. We already talked about Lebedev, but here we also have Kalancha and Suslov, both of which followed Lebedev when he left the group and created the Clear Sky faction, shortly after the birth of the Zone. A nice detail found in X-8 is a photo of Lebedev himself, where he appears much younger than he was during the events of Clear Sky. Apart from the documents, X-8 also contains other kinds of lootable items, such as ammo and meds. One strange thing is the presence of antibiotics inside the lab. This is very weird, because this drug is supposed to have been recently developed by Professor Ozerski. It could just be an oversight by the developers, but it could also mean that the scientists working in the Zone created a similar antibiotic years ago, maybe even before emissions were a thing, since the Zone did not yet exist. Well, who knows? X-8, like all the other labs, cannot be fully explored, as it contains many locked doors. Therefore, it is possible that we are missing on some other important information. Moreover, this would not be an Anomalous Dugout video if I did not talk about the fact that the lab is still powered in electricity, at least partially. I don't think this is due to the generator we restarted on the top floor, as it looks to be used only by the elevator. Once again I ask the question, how are the lights and ventilation shafts powered? Also, do we have infinite steam coming out of this tank? Unfortunately, we won't answer these questions just yet, but maybe another time. And so that's pretty much all I had to say about Lab X-8. This was actually the last underground location we had to cover, but still many mysteries remain. My intention is to close out the Secret Underground Location series in a future video, the 9th and final episode. This episode will contain a recap of all the important information we learned about the X-Labs along the way, as well as some theories about the questions which have not been answered. In the meantime, make sure to share your own thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, stalkers, and goodbye.